the confusion does not fall. The same thing happens with the post-truth. We understand the Oxford Dictionary on the term, and we believe there is something true about that. The fact is that people are going more for the gossip online that we share with friends or relatives. It's easier, it's faster, and you hear what you want, than really researching for good, analytical, investigative journalism. And this is a very complicated trend, but it also proves why oftentimes we don't understand the vote of many nations, whether it be on plebiscites or whether it be on elections. And the popularity of some sort of very strange populist politicians that are going back to messages of racism, xenophobia, and fear-mongering amongst the audience. So today, more than ever, is when we really have to analyze these policies and the protection of journalism, of free journalism. There's another trend, I was commenting with some colleagues over breakfast, that there's also there's a rise in violence and there's a rise in censorship. And in the question of violence, one very preoccupying sign for us is this question of increased harassment of women journalists. But there's also the rise of other phenomena that are not as visible, such as monitoring communications and surveillance. So we're now beginning to do some studies on privacy, and within privacy on the protection of sources, which for us is crucial. Freedom of the press is dependent on many things, on freedom of the press legal framework, on freedom of the press and freedom of expression and general policies, on safety of journalists from all forms of harassment, physical or legal harassment, but also is linked to privacy and to the possibility of protecting their material and protecting their sources. All these are issues that are interconnected. So whatever you're doing in this regard is really very important at this crucial moment. We believe, this is sort of two words that I have today, but that the risk is increasing as the technology grows. And definitely we're not against technology. In the area of communication, we support journalism, but we also support the use of ICTs and the development of research. We are participating in the WSIS follow-up meetings. We're part of the Broadband Commission. We do programs on ICTs for people with disabilities. So we strongly believe in the new technologies, which should be used for the good. But we also think there are many pitfalls, and these technologies also are creating certain degree of vulnerabilities that we must be aware of, and to which journalism has to have prevention. This really is a call for many of you to research in this area, to investigate in this area. I congratulate you very much. This has been probably the biggest May 3rd event that UNESCO has organized. I have only been 1 year in UNESCO, but I have spoken with my colleagues about the others. I've seen the data. Southeast Asia has always been a well-organized region, and today this event has people from 95 countries or more. So this is a very powerful instrument. And for you academics from around the world, and those of you who are listening to us on the live feed, I think this is a very important moment to all of us unite forces. One last word, maybe we have said it all along, is that this June in Geneva, we're going to be doing an evaluation of the UN Plan of Action for Safety of Journalists, with all the agencies concerned, inviting NGOs that work on freedom of expression, and inviting journalist associations, inviting obviously the delegations of the different member states in Geneva, and inviting academics like yourselves. So all the contributions you may have will be welcome, and we would certainly invite you to participate. It will be in June 29th in Geneva. So congratulations for this meeting, and we're looking forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Thanks again, Frank. Frank's reports as special rapporteur are still available, I guess, on the UNESCO special rapporteur website, and I've personally found them as an academic trying to understand the law and policy around freedom of expression issues, completely cutting edge. And I've cited his own reports, innumerable times in my own research, and if you haven't discovered his special reports as well as his annual reports, please do explore them. So we'll go ahead with our first session of the morning. We're delighted to introduce the chair, Angela Romano from QT in Australia, who will take over the morning. Thank you. Do you want to be seated? I don't want to speak at a time, I think, because then otherwise they won't be able to see the presentations.
Okay, we have a slight change to the program. So we have 4 speakers today. Our first is from Indonesia, Masud, who is a PhD student in Germany, who will be talking about the topic of assessing threats to Indonesian journalists, cases, actors, and motives.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Angela Romano. It's great to meet you here. I'm very happy to be here to present my topic. And first of all, I would say thanks to the organizer, Charian, and the team for making this conference likely possible. Okay, what I'm going to talk this morning for you is about my assessment, my data. It's mainly on the basic information about the Indonesian journalist trade. It includes cases, actors, and motive. And all of the data I found from this for this presentation is based mainly from the in your reports done by the Line of Independent Journalists. It's one of the prominent journalist association in Indonesia. Within the past 6 years, from 2010 up to about 2016. So here's the title, and you can see also the pictures, the protest from Society of Indonesia against the journalist crime. Here the flow of my presentation. I will start by outlining the Indonesian media and journalists, and then continue by overview of journalist legal policy framework, and then going to the main presentation about cases, motive, and actor of the journalist crimes, and then I will end by policy recommendations. So here a slightly overview of media and journalist situation in Indonesia. You can see. I guess most of you are aware of this situation. It's currently Indonesian media system like a monopolistic ownership model with only about 13 key players dominate the media landscape. And broadcasting still or television remain a dominant source of opinion and news. And there is currently ongoing domination of media tycoon, politician seeking political power. We have a problem in Indonesia that there is no exact data on how media number. If we go into the Press Council assessment, currently Indonesia has 1,081 print media, and then about more than 740 radio and television stations. And similarly, we have also a problem in how to exact the data on journalists working for media. According to the World of Journalism study where I engaged in this project, Indonesia has about more than 20,000 working journalists. They mostly stay in Jakarta or in Java Island. This is a bit old observation from him about the media ownership in Indonesia. I will just quick. From this table, you can see a framework of legal protection, formal regulation for media and journalists, where Indonesia at least has about 2-3 four main regulations. The first and the very important regulation for Indonesian media and journalists is the Press Law number 40, established by 1999, and this regulation provides a formal guarantee for journalist freedom and also for media activities included in this. And also, this law established formal regulatory bodies, namely Dewan Pers or Indonesian Press Council. But there is a problem in this law. For instance, there is no detailed explanation on the tool of journalist protection, and also there is no specific judicial mechanism for the case of journalist rape. The second regulation that connect to the protection or maintaining the press and journalist freedom in Indonesia is the broadcasting law. The number of the law is 32, established 2002. This law provides plurality of broadcasting organization, broadcasting ownership, and establish independent broadcasting commission as independent non-state regulatory body, namely Komisi Penyiaran Indonesia. But also, similar with the press law, there is a significant problem from this act that there is no strict limitation of broadcasting ownership. There is no also strong mandate of KPI to regulate the broadcasting industry. And we have also the other two regulations. The openness of public information law and information and electronic transaction law. Concerning the limitation of time, I will directly go to the main presentation today. It is the data of the trend of intimidation to journalists within the past 5 years, from 2010 up to 2015. You can see here there are about 5 format of or 5 model of intimidation. The crucial model is the murder cases, and then the prohibition of coverings, and then physical harassment and lawsuits, and then destruction of media office or equipment. If we try to observe the table, there is like a decrease in case of murder because the last cases, it was in 2010, the 4 journalists murdered, but in the last 5 years, there is no cases on this type of intimidation. But if we compare to the prohibition of covering, there is the increasing trend of cases, where in 2015 there are about 12 cases compared to the previous time. And also on the next model of cases, we can see there is a stable in number. For instance, in the physical harassment, there is a stable cases in number from 2010 up to 2015. So overall, if we try to look in this table, there is an increasing number of physical harassment, but there is a decreasing number of murder cases of journalists, and there are also stable situation in terms of number of physical lawsuit, destruction of media office, and so on. And now the next table provides about the picture of motive related to the crime against journalists. If we see this table, we can observe that there are many different motives of crime against journalists. For instance, in case of murder, the motives mainly connect to the terror aiming to stop an investigation to corruption cases. But if we see on the physical harassment, there is a different motive here because it's mainly driven by terror of individual journalists, and I mean by a straight critic of ongoing non-balanced news done by media houses. Also, if we go into the case of lawsuit, we can see that there is a stable motive before and after the new order regime. It was a terror by law and disagree with the accepted right of reply and the rule of press council to mediate between the conflict parties. And now we move to the actors of crimes. If we look at this table, particularly between 2012 and 2016, there is a stable type of actors. It's the policeman as the highest perpetrator in number, and then followed by the government official. But if we try to compare between 2012 and 2016, there is a slightly a movement from the state apparatus as the main perpetrator, going to communalism or going to a radical group of society. And if we try to compare between motive and actors, I can find that before 2010, the actors mainly come from state apparatus, but after 2010, it moved from many kind of actors, state apparatus, communalism, and also media owners. In terms of motive, before 2010, mostly about abuse of press freedom, but now, or after 2010, it's mostly connected to abuse of press freedom, but also critique over massive attack of journalistic ethic done by media owners or professionals. Concerning time limitation, so I have to be quick. This is the example of physical intimidation to recently to Metro TV journalists done in 2017. This is what I mean by example of street critique over political bias of media coverage done by media houses. And in this case, not only journalists as a victim, but also in my opinion, the mass, the society, the radical group is also a victim done by the media houses, whom politicians seeking a political power. This is the short data on the how journalists violate the code of journalistic ethic, coming from the complaint of public sending to Indonesian Press Council. So I will just try to summarize and give a recommendation. In summary, we can see that the threat over journalists in Indonesia during the past 6 years, from 2010 up to now, is increasing, particularly in the format or in the type of physical harassment. As a specific note that Indonesia still has internal agenda. We have still a big agenda because about 12 journalists murdered during 1996 up to present is unsolved. The cases is remain no answer, no final case, no final result. And in terms of actor, we can see that the dominant actors remain state apparatus, but also there is incoming actors. Is it the radical group or mass communalism coming from Islamic radical organization and etc. About the model of motive, we can see that it ranges from terror against press freedom and street protest to political intervention and imbalance reporting. From this summary, I'm trying to give a short recommendation that firstly, there is the need to review the policy, the Press and Broadcasting Act, in order to detail protection of journalist work and to ensure the plurality of media ownership and to strict the rule of owners not to be a politician or not going to be to use the media for a practical political interest. Second, and the last recommendation is there is the need to empower press council capacity in managing public complaint and the media's responsibility to their internal ethic of journalistic practice. That's all. Thanks for your attention this morning.
Now, format today is that we will have all four speakers together, and then we'll have question time at the end. So please do save your questions from us. Our next speaker is a professor of communications and culture, Jose Luis Benitez. He will be talking about freedom of the press and violence against journalists in the northern triangle of South America.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to Hong Kong Baptist University and all of you here in this academic conference. I will present this morning kind of general perspective about three countries in Central America: El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So, first of all, well, if we look at the map, you see we are very close to Mexico, which is also a very dangerous place for journalists. And in Central America, we call this area the Northern Triangle. We have a particular problems, I think, that are very common to all of us. Specifically, we are very well known around the world because of the level of violence that we have in each of our countries. So if we look at some issues from Honduras, probably of these three countries, Honduras is the most dangerous for journalists. It has been very, very dangerous. According to the World Press Freedom Index, Honduras is in the position 140 out of 180 countries, so it's really low. Honduras, according to the Reporters Without Borders, is one of the hemisphere's highest rates of impunity. There have been several killings of journalists in Honduras, and very, very few cases have been investigated and have been going into some judicial processes. On the other hand, according to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Honduras has a big problem in terms of trying to put into place training programs and implement guidelines for public officials, especially police and security forces, on respecting the media, including guidelines that specifically address issues of gender, as Fran Laroe was mentioning about the differences in terms of what is going on with women journalists in these countries. And if we look at Guatemala, Guatemala is in a position 118 in the last World Press Freedom Index. Indeed, Fran Laroe, he's from Guatemala, and Guatemala has been in the last years one of the countries with more journalists killed. Just last year, there were at least 8 people killed in Guatemala, according to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights report. They call it, as we were saying yesterday, they call it communicators, not journalists, because not necessarily some of them are journalists, but they work in radio stations, specifically in the rural communities, and so this is an issue. Of course, also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights are calling to the state of Guatemala for investigate these crimes, and specifically to understand that if a journalist is killed, there is a big problem for the society at all, not only for the journalist itself and the media. El Salvador is probably, compared of these three countries, is in a better position, a little bit. It's in the position 62 in the World Press Freedom. And we have also some cases of journalists that have been killed. Specifically, last year there was a journalist from a community radio that was killed in El Salvador. Specifically, the investigation in this case showed that it was killed by gangs that we have in El Salvador. In the 3 countries, we have very spread problem of gangs, youth gangs. The same, the Inter-American Commission in the case of El Salvador are looking at the issue of how to investigate these cases and how the state can do something about it. So if we think of the context of violence in these countries, we can think of actors of violence and the types of violence that we are facing. We can say that there are some cases where the state actors are the ones who are doing some kind of violence against journalists, like for example, in press conferences, coverage of public events. Also, there have been some cases of cyber attacks to private media that supposedly are coming from some official authorities. And also we have some cases of detention or interrogation of journalists by the police or other state authorities. On the other hand, the non-state actors, young gangs, organized crime, or social protest, we have some cases more in the non-state actors of threat, verbal attacks, and destruction of journalists' footage or information. This is happening in some communities, specifically in marginalized communities in these 3 countries, where sometimes the journalists go there and the gangs, they say, we need your camera, we need your information, you are not going to have this information published. Of course, we have cases of physical violence, as we mentioned, aggression and killings that are really dangerous. And also we include in this perspective what kind of violence comes from the media outlet itself, because sometimes we just look at the media, at the state or non-state actors, but also there are some issues that happen because the media is not helping the journalists, or the media is posing a limitation. For example, violation of labor rights and working conditions for safety of journalists and media workers that happen in several cases where journalists, they have really, really bad conditions, work conditions. Also, the issue of self-censorship practices, political polarization that is very strong in El Salvador and in Honduras specifically, and also the issue of media concentration, and the lack of ethical standard and professional practices that are also crucial for this issue. So if we look at the perspective of protection mechanism for journalists in these 3 countries, we don't have a specific protection mechanism in the case of El Salvador and Guatemala. There is only a specific law to protect journalists, which also includes human rights defenders, social communicators, and operators of justice. In Honduras, this is a law that was approved in 2015. In the other cases, in El Salvador and Guatemala, there are some efforts, some initiatives to try to promote a specific mechanism for protection of journalists. In both cases, I think the state and the civil society organization are not together and not in cooperation probably in this idea of promoting some kind of protection. In the case of El Salvador, that I know more, when we talk about this issue with some official authorities, they said, well, the problem is that if we protect journalists, everybody wants a specific mechanism, the taxi drivers and everybody. So you are the same, no? We are not looking at the journalists as special. So this is a big problem because they see that as a privilege. And finally, in the case of Honduras, there are several limitations that are now into place, and there are also some organizations trying to cooperate with the implementation of this law to protect journalists. but there are budget constraints, there are some problems in implementation of physical protection measures. And also, it seems that there are several disagreements between the state authorities and civil society organizations in the National Protection Council that is part of the coordination area in this case in Honduras. So in conclusion, I would pose here probably a couple of things that I think we can look from the more academic research perspective, how we can look at comparative studies in the sense of looking national context, taking into consideration, of course, the specific political, geographical, and sociocultural dimension of the safety of journalists and media workers in each country. It seems that many times we just look at, I'm talking about Central America perspective, from the academia or the policymakers more in the national framework, but not in comparative perspective. So I think this is a challenge, how to do comparative studies, what are the importance of this type of study. And of course, it's not easy because it demands collaboration and it demands some kind of interrelation among some of these institutions, universities, or civil society organizations. The second one, I think that it's important to analyze the implication and perception of journalism in societies with high levels of violence, such as the Northern Triangle of Central America. The critical role of journalism in reporting on issues such as organized crime, extrajudicial killings, and human rights abuses by the police and other official authorities, I think is very, very important, because what happened, for example, in the case of El Salvador, that we have some of this extrajudicial killing situation, is that when some media outlets report about these extrajudicial killings, some people perceive that the media or the journalists are, with the bad guys. And so this is a very challenging situation, how journalists face, even from the general public, some kind of misperception of the role that they are doing, trying to inform that there have been some human rights abuses that have to be known and has to be addressed. There have been a couple of cases in El Salvador in the last 2 years of media reporter, or media coverage of some extrajudicial killings that the government denied, but then they had to accept that there was an extrajudicial killings, and now the police officers are in judicial processes. And finally, I think it's of course important in this perspective of safety of journalists to evaluate the quality of content, sources, and professional journalist practices, and identify new ways for strengthening the ethical standard and safety of journalists. We discuss a lot in Central America the importance of strengthening the ethical perspective or the ethical practice of journalists, because these go hand in hand with the safety. In other words, I think somebody was mentioning yesterday from the Philippines, I think, that sometimes, the professional practices of some journalists or some radio commentators is not contributing to understanding, not contributing to a good debate. So that is happening in some cases. I'm not saying that the people that have been killed is because they are not ethical. It's just saying that if we look at the practices, the journalist practices, we need to look at this in terms of how the journalists and the media workers can strengthen the ethical practices, and this undoubtedly is going to strengthen the safety that they have when they are doing their work. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Peter Jimbo, and he is a senior lecturer from Lagos State University. He's going to be talking to us about the safety of journalists as a component of press freedom in Nigeria.
the safety of journalists as component of press freedom in Nigeria. Well, as a way of introduction, journalists are expected to play and do play critical roles in society. The functional analysis provided by Laswell and Wright summarizes these functions as surveillance of the environment, correlation of society responding to that environment, transmission of cultural heritage from one generation to the other, and entertainment. But to carry out these functions, society provides one form of protection or the other to journalists. Nigeria is no exception. And the contention has been whether these protections are adequate and whether they are implemented faithfully. Even though the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999, tasks the press to uphold the responsibility and accountability of the government to the people. That's in section 22. Furthermore, it states that every person shall be entitled to freedom of expression, including freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart ideas and information. Oh, okay. Okay.
You can see the other two as well, last time.
You didn't turn it around.
Just your screen.
Oh, okay. Let me Yes, one of the major contentions of this convention is that they are located in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which contains the fundamental, objective, and directive principles of state policy. The lofty provisions in this section are not justiciable, meaning that you cannot go to court to enforce whatever lofty ideas that are enshrined in that section of the Constitution. So, the ordeal of the press in Nigeria they are legion, and they include very journalists from coastal media houses from covering government activities. The most recent happened to the State House correspondent of the Punch, as he was escorted out of the State House by the Chief Security Officer to the President because he wrote 2 articles on the health status of the President. This happened only 2 weeks ago, and in the 2-part analysis, he wrote what was considered obvious: the inability of the President to attend the State Council meeting and to attend to other state matters openly. So, when he reported for duty to cover his beat, he was manhandled and escorted out physically and asked never to come back to the State House. Although the newspaper has been resident and has opposed and is threatening to go to court to enforce the right of journalists to cover the State House. Then there's been seizure and destruction of camera and other equipment. There's been assault and battery. Of course, in the long run, and the historical analysis, there have been death of journalists through passive bomb, and other means, Bagadakato, And most recently, a radio reporter in Bayelsa State was shot dead. That is just about 3 weeks ago. Of course, there are also the laws and regulations that are inimical to the proper functioning of the media. But the concern of my study is that we have focused more on what the government does to the press rather than what media organizations have done to their workers, journalists. The literature of press freedom is dominated by studies focused on governmental reprisals and failure to provide a enabling environment for the media. Beyond this focus on government, critical as it is the seeming neglect or lack of studies on how media establishment wittingly or unwittingly undermine press freedom through failure to engender a working environment that promotes the dignity, welfare, and well-being of journalists. This failure by media establishment, this study postulated, is as injurious, if not more injurious, to press freedom and what the government has done or failed to do. Our colleagues from the Western Hemisphere may not be able to imagine the situation we are describing here. That somebody will work for some time, months, and will not be paid. It happens. So, in testing this postulation, this study used content analysis and in-depth interviews to gauge the working environment of the Nigerian journalists. Specifically, the objective of the study were to identify safety provisions, gauge their adequacy, and capture journalists' perception of their safety in the workplace. It is still an ongoing study, but we have some indications and some preliminary findings, which I will highlight below. Comprehensive insurance policies are a rarity, and even where they exist, journalists have no ready access to the terms and conditions therein. During the interviews, one of the questions was to ask, what is the insurance policy of your organization? Some say, well, I've been told there is one, I have not seen it. And answers to that effect, well, it does exist, but I have not seen it. And sometimes some people leave the media houses without reference to the way they disengage and their entitlements. But what I consider the unkindest cut of them all is the failure to meet the basic requirements of paying salaries regularly. At the best of times, the salaries are low in media houses, are paid, but increasingly, more media houses are unable and sometimes unwilling to pay salaries as because if you analyze the revenue flowing in through some of those media houses, through advertisements, supplements, I mean, a cursory look will show that this is a viable media. And then you still find that sometimes they do not pay, running up to 6 months in 2 particular cases in the study population. One of the respondents from a seemingly thriving newspaper said, I joined this media house about 2 years ago and been paid only 3 times. Incredible as the above may seem, it is not an isolated case. Those familiar with the media environment in Nigeria are aware of this situation. Journalists in the above situation are very amenable to manipulation by just any interested party. As I'll put it, they are outsourced to their sources. Because if you cannot take care of your immediate needs, if you cannot take care of your family, the need to survive is there, and therefore you are amenable to whatever is available in the open environment. And it gets worse because Nigeria is officially in economic recession, and that disposes weak media houses to inability to meet their obligations to their staff. An analysis of the difference in the ability of media to meet welfare obligations show a better performance from government-owned media houses, mostly electronic, than privately owned media. Some of these get subventions from government, to survive. But the private media have to operate within the economic realities in the country. And so sometimes they are unable to meet their obligations, and I say sometimes they are willing to. The study also shows that the method of disengaging workers in some media houses are unfair. Cases of downsizing, right-sizing, and dismissal from job do not follow best practices. In many cases, journalists were disengaged without compensation and with impunity from their employers. Conclusion and recommendation. In all, journalists interviewed perceive their working environment to be unsafe and their future not protected when they retire. There is therefore a need to focus more on the internal working, that is, a structural environment of journalists, while not losing focus on the normative or political environment. We might continue to talk about what government does and what they do not do. Yet, if the structure, the internal structure within which they operate, are not looked after, and we need more data on that angle to be able to make informed judgment and conclusion. For journalists to advance peaceful, just, and inclusive society, the structural environment must be just, must be fair, and protective of the interests of the practitioners. I thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Our final presenter is a fellow at the University of Wollongong, and she will be about journalism sources in the digital age. Yeah, it's easy.
Hi everybody. Yes, my name is Judy Cassetti. I'm a journalist and academic, and I'm from Australia, but I produced this study which has just been officially released in another session during the plenary this morning, Projecting Journalism Sources in the Digital Age. It was commissioned by UNESCO, and I produced it while I was a research fellow with the World Editors Forum and the World Association of News Publishers during 2014 and 15. And it has just been released, as I said. It takes some time for works to wend their way through UNESCO to publication, but it's a really significant study, and I'm not just saying that because it's got my name attached to it. I'm saying it because it covers 121 countries, and it examines the protection of sources in those countries in terms of the changes to legal frameworks over the past decade. So there's a huge amount of data, as you can imagine, that we had to mine our way through. And we've made a range of really quite significant for a UN body recommendations in this publication. to do with the need for law reform and also for activism on the part of journalists and civil society to ensure that the conditions that currently exist in countries where there are source protection laws, to ensure that those conditions are able to work in the digital era, not just in the analogue world, where, to give you a practical example, I could have sat in court and refused to reveal the name of my source in an investigative context in Australia, where there are very strong analogue era source protection laws now in 6 of our states. But any of my communications on this phone or on my laptop or my hard drive may well have been subjected to exposure, so they may have been seized without reference to such laws. So that's just to give you one example of where there are gaps that we're examining. So we're suggesting that those laws need to be updated, but also that there need to be significant changes made in the area of data protection law and in the area of the overreach of national security and anti-terrorism legislation that is frequently being enacted to justify the exposure of journalist sources in legal investigations. So to run through some of the headlines, as I've said, the legal frameworks where they do exist are under significant strain in this era, and they're under significant strain because they're increasingly at risk of intrusion, and that's intrusion that comes in the form of corporate and state actors. And by intrusion, we're talking about specifically, as I said, mass and targeted surveillance and data retention policies, which can last up to 5 years in some contexts, which mean that under certain circumstances, judicial authorities, but also police, national security organisations, for example, can seek to mine that data and can do so in secrecy and without any capacity for a journalist or a news organisation to, in an adversarial way, try and combat that kind of order. I've actually just gone through the findings and now I'm telling you who I am and where I'm from because my slides were in the wrong order, so I apologise for that. But you can find me on Twitter, hence the handle. So a little bit about the research process. As I said, UNESCO commissioned this. Initially, it was designed as a study to update a piece of work done by Privacy International in 2007, which sought to map existing source protection laws in terms of where they existed. Was it at constitutional level, was it at state level or national level, for example. It was perceived that that would be a relatively straightforward task because we had a list of countries where we knew source protection legislation existed, and it was our objective to update those countries and to try and determine if there had been any new legislative shifts. What we found instead was this emergence of convergent threats to the existing source protection legislation, which comes in the form of those issues that I just described. So we had a small and overworked and underpaid team of research assistants, and when I say we, I mean me, and also two or three, I think, international academics who worked on investigating in their own countries the circumstances and also assisted with some of the interviewing process that was associated with this study. So we did a deep dive, an environmental scan online, and searching databases where they existed, confronting the usual kinds of impediments like the absence of data in certain regions, and that's down to both a lack of transparency potentially, but also a lack of connectivity, so digitally, so that a lot of data doesn't necessarily make it online. We then distributed surveys. We had about, I think, 135 or 140 survey respondents. The survey was distributed across news organisations, through civil society organisations, especially focused on law and human rights and journalism. And then we conducted about 50 long-form qualitative interviews with experts who were identified through that survey process. So it had a rigorous methodology behind it. So one of the key findings was that 69% of the countries that we identified, that 121 group of UNESCO countries, states, that 69% demonstrated shifts or developments in the legal source protection framework, and in many cases, in fact in most cases, those shifts were negative. There are some instances where new source protection laws have been introduced in individual states, and there have been some significant judgments, particularly in the European context, that have sought to try and recognise these digital era threats in the past decade. But it's not a fabulous story, and that's partly because we're dealing with such a convergence of threats in the context of the so-called, in the West, war on terrorism, which allows the sorts of justifications to be made by states, and I'll just quote my own country because I think it's best to criticise one's own country in these settings. To give you an example, in Australia it has now been criminalised to reveal information about offshore detention centres, the detainment of refugees and asylum seekers. So journalism that seeks to expose whether it's corruption or abuse in those centres has to be dependent upon confidential sources, because jail sentences are likely for people who reveal. That it also covers lawyers and doctors, so it's pretty stringent. And journalists who report on what's deemed to be national security information can go to jail for up to 10 years. And as well, if the government seeks to mine your metadata, which it can, and which it did illegally just last week with a journalist, we don't know which journalist, if you reveal the fact that your metadata has been mined, or that there's been a warrant sought for the interrogation of your digital communications, so your emails, your cell phone records and so on, you can be jailed for up to 2 years for revealing that. This is happening in a progressive Western democracy, and that's something that we saw repeated, particularly in the Five Eyes countries, so the US, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia. So this is not just a case of a Western academic journalist lecturing the rest of the world about the way things should be at all. So what we're recommending is that there needs to be a substantial strengthening of those protections where they do exist, and that if we don't manage to try and counteract some of these impacts, it's going to actually be quite difficult to sustain the sort of high-level investigative journalism that we have seen that has led to the exposure of corruption and breaches of rights. For example, I just came from the plenary session where I launched this book. Upstairs, there is a Ghanaian journalist sitting on stage with his face covered. It is that critical to his safety that he not reveal himself. His sources are similarly compromised. So anonymity and the need to adapt practice to ensure that where it's possible, encryption, for example, is used in communications is something that we've highlighted as well. So journalists are adapting their practices. They're going back to analogue methods. We had lots of journalists and editors talk about doing things like, as was the case in Argentina at La Nación, driving for 3 hours, doing a source on a dirt road for 15 minutes and getting back in the car and driving for 3 hours back to the newspaper to try and avoid detection. And we had journalists referring to scenes from All the President's Men, discussing going to dark car parks, discussing going to parks in unknown suburbs or off the map suburbs to try and have meetings. These are some of the risks of exposure of sources. So we protect sources because we offer a commitment that is designed to ensure that our sources are not exposed and therefore not subject to reprisals. And it's fair to say that while the risks in terms of these digital interferences are just as significant in Western developed democracies, the price that sources pay in other settings, and we just heard an extraordinary story at the other session from the editor of the newspaper La Norte, who said that he had to close his newspaper because his journalists were being killed with impunity. It goes to reason that the sources of that journalism are even more at risk potentially. So these are some of the issues that we confront. Additional findings include the fact that we need new training mechanisms, that legal advice has become part of the storytelling process in a much more significant and costly way than it previously was. Alan Rusbridger told me when he was still the editor, and he did an interview for this study, when he was still the editor of The Guardian, that it was costing him, the newspaper millions more pounds each year to undertake investigative journalism because of the legal costs associated with trying to keep their digital communications secure and ensuring that their sources were not exposed. So there's a model framework that we developed, which was issued ahead of the release of this study, which I've got a copy of here. There's some other copies floating around the building, copies of the book as well. And the model framework has 11 points. It's designed to allow individual states and civil society organisations and journalist groups to measure the state of their own country's ability to measure up to standards. So please have a look at that. And as I said just before, we are in a situation where these issues are urgent. We need to get people across academia, across civil society, across the media to examine the findings and the recommendations, but with a view to action. You know, as an academic, I know that we need to publish academically and we need to ensure that there's impact at that level. But this is one of those issues that needs to cross over into action, in my view. So the process for developing that 11-point framework was rigorous. It involved a combination of deep dive research online and interviews with some of the world's leading experts in this space. So we made a range of recommendations which you can read about in the book. One that I haven't mentioned yet is the need to recognise and to respond to the fact that where source protection legislation does exist, and we believe that it should exist broadly, whistleblower protections in parallel strengthen source protection, so they work in tandem. We also found that one of the big gaps, and this extended even to Sweden, I don't know if we have any Swedish academics in the room, we did a big case study on, one cringes in the background, we did a big case study on the state of source protection in Sweden, specifically because we acknowledged that the strongest, the most rigorous source protection laws in the world existed in Sweden. We found that there the challenges are similar. There's a need for reform in the Swedish legal environment. So share that, Swedish friends, with your colleagues. One of the big gaps, this applied in Sweden as it did elsewhere, was that, as I said, laws that apply to paper-based documentation, you know, what's in my head, which can't be forced out of me, do not apply necessarily to digital devices. That's certainly an issue that was acknowledged in Sweden. So the other factor is the education and the training, which I talked about, and the need to possibly even collaborate on training sources. So journalists starting to educate their sources about how to have secure communications, because one of the greatest points of risk for exposure is at the point where a source makes contact in the first instance with a journalist. You know, using the work email without thinking or without appreciating what the risks are, and that happens in a number of cases. We also significantly identified acts of journalism as distinct from journalists as the recipients of source protection, because that's another gap that exists. We're arguing that for human rights defenders like Amnesty International, for academic bloggers, you know, for lawyers, human rights lawyers, for example, who have access to information based on confidential sources, that the laws should apply equally to them. And I haven't got time to go into any more of this, but suffice to say, these challenges are having a big impact on the production of investigative journalism and on some of the outcomes in legal settings. And there are two cases from the US, the Ryson and the Rosen case, that demonstrate that even if a journalist refuses to, on pain of prison, identify their sources, the state can and will identify them through other means, whether that be covert or legally or illegally. So I'll stop there and can you ask questions and answer them hopefully. It's free online, so if you have access online, you can read it digitally and download it as an ebook, but there are hard copies floating around.
If all our speakers could come to the front, that will make it easier for people to ask questions of you. I'll recap very briefly because we've had actually a lovely flow of ideas. Our first two speakers looked at the nature of, attacks on journalists. And in Indonesia, we saw Mas Duki recognising that despite a range of media laws that in theory should show that the state fact, the institutions of state are regularly harassing, threatening journalists, and civil society has become more active in threatening journalists as well. And, thus recommending that we need stronger legislation, reviews to legislation, mostly media ownership, and greater powers among bodies like the Press Council to address issues that concern the public, such as professionalism and ethics and so on. I think we saw similar trends in Central America, where in Honduras, Guatemala and El Salvador, we saw these attacks continuing on journalists, murders, harassment, threats, violence, and state actors as well as non-state actors again being very active, and recommendations here about how comparative studies may assist in, identifying new ways for identifying how to both strengthen the ethical standards of journalists when these issues are of concern to society, and mechanisms for enshrining the safety of journalists. Jide Timor provided a slightly different perspective from Nigeria by pointing out that, in a context where, again, we have a constitution that in theory enshrines freedom of the press, we actually in practice have assault, threats, murder. Much of the research has focused on the actions of government and those who are engaging in these threats, and that it is time to look a little bit more closely at the media organisations themselves, and found failures in the frequency and adequacy of the payments to journalists, lack of insurance, insecure job environments, a whole series of setups where journalists themselves were vulnerable to manipulation or alignment politically with other outside sources. And finally, a shift with Julie Pacetti's presentation to the sources themselves and how we protect acts of journalism in a more broader sense, particularly given this increased, the changes that have been brought by new technology and the possibilities for increased surveillance of what journalists are doing, the data retention, the possibility of asking for materials about journalistic activities, thus preventing increased vulnerability of sources who talk about all sorts of topics that may offend both businesses and government and other actors in civil society. So we have quite a broad picture here that our four presenters have painted for us. Maybe if we take 2 or 3 questions and then allow the panel to answer them as a group. So, yes. We have a microphone.
Thank you. I am Vijay from Leiden University. My question is to all presenters. I noticed that one of the challenges to protect the safety of the journalists are the journalists. In Indonesian case, Mas Duki present an example that there is insufficient regulation in terms of law that will protect the journalists. And I noticed that in other countries there are more or less similarity. So my question would be, what can we do to deal with this situation? And we talk about law, so we usually talk about the legislation process, and we talk about politicians. How is the situation of our journalists, how the relation of our journalists all over the world to the, for instance, to the public, to the journalists, of course, they have mass media. I mean, how we can make such a movement to bring about change in terms of the law, and to make that, to make sure that the journalists will be adequately protected by the law itself. Thank you.
Maybe someone else? You start. I just finished speaking.
So I'm the person. Thank you, Mas Vijay, for the feedback. Yeah, I do agree with you because, in my opinion, in maybe the last 10 years, there is like the low attention from the global agencies to Indonesian law reform. Most of the international agencies, in my opinion, is taking focus only to the managerial or operational, like a content-based advocacy. For instance, like in my PhD studies, how to empower the public broadcaster in Indonesia, but most of the international agencies taking focus only to like the content modeling for broadcaster, not taking attention to the broadly law reform. This means that we need this area to strengthen, for instance, maybe by the UNESCO initiative again. And yes, the collaboration is a key issue today, but between us to make this idea progressively done. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. It's a really good question. How do you activate communities? Particularly, the broad theme of this conference is around trust and truth. And I don't want to use the term fake news because it has been so weaponized, but looking at the way audiences respond to journalists. So I wrote, just a practical example, I wrote an op-ed for the Sydney Morning Herald about the implications of this study. And the reaction in online comments and on social channels was entirely full of abuse of journalists and evidence of a lack of faith and trust in journalists. A lot of it was just Trump-inspired trolling, but it indicates the sort of difficulty we have in terms of shifting hearts and minds in our community. I think we have to, from my perspective, with regard to this research, we have to bring it back to the implications for society. What are the elements of, if you're in a democratic setting, what are the elements of that democratic setting that you value? For me, transparency, accountability, freedom of expression are human rights that I absolutely value. So I think part of our responsibility as journalists and as academics who need to communicate in an understandable way to broad audiences is to be activist in that regard and to highlight back to our communities what's at stake here. It's all very well to mock the journalists. And in my own company, where job cuts have just been announced while I've been here, some of the reaction to that is heartbreaking. The people don't know what they're going to lose when there is nobody left to speak truth to power in a way that professional journalists, even those who work unpaid, which is also staggering to hear. So that's my soapbox moment. I think that's what it's going to take. Sorry, you need the microphone.
Well, I think that your question about how we can do something in terms of, for example, of changing or promoting new laws to protect journalists. As I explained in the case of Honduras, well, they have this saying, in Honduras they said, we have law for everything. But the problem is that, it doesn't work. I mean, it's not something that makes some changes. So I think that even in some other cases, in El Salvador, Guatemala, and other countries, some people, they are not sure that the solution is to have a law itself, because sometimes you can have it, but then nothing happens with that law. So our approach in some of the projects that we have been working in Central America is similar to what she said, is how to create more collaboration, more cooperation between civil society organization, between the media organization, between the media association, and of course to have a good dialogue with the authorities, to have also a good understanding, as I mentioned, because it seems to me that sometimes in our countries in Central America, the authorities, they think that journalists, well, are just, other workers, like as I said, when we have been in this possibility to talk with some authorities, they said, yeah, everybody needs protection in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. This is a very dangerous area, so everybody, so why just the journalists? So it seemed to me that we need to work more, and I think the academia has an important role also in terms of media literacy and how we understand the role of journalists, the role of information, and how this is really crucial for democracy. So I think that this is something that we need to look at each context, and of course, from the university perspective, as yesterday was mentioning, I think we have to do more of what we are doing now.
okay. Yes, what Jose Luis was saying about ethics going hand in hand with safety, and I think perhaps it also relates to what Jide was saying about journalists being outsourced to their sources. So I would just be interested if you could speak a bit more about that. I'm Tamsin Mitchell from York University in the UK.
Okay. Thank you. The context within which we speak in is a bit pathetic. And if you fail to provide the support, the protection that your worker needs, it is possible, in fact, almost inevitable, that somebody else with interests that might be inimical to your goal and to the goal of society to take over. Now, in Nigeria, there is a concept of brown envelope. Brown envelope is a term used to describe handouts given to journalists by sources and interested parties to influence what they write, to influence the direction of story and the direction of narrative. For a long time, the battle has been on to discourage journalists from taking brown envelope. But how is that possible? If at the end of the month, your real envelope does not come, and you need to survive. So that's why I think we still need to focus more on those issues so that people will get their justifiable wages where they work and work in an environment where they can uphold their own dignity and then work professionally and ethically. You know, that is the sum of what we are trying to project here. It is very real, very real. You know, people live not on their wages, but what they get outside their wages.
Well, I think that is a very broad question of how we can, look at ethics and safety in several of the contexts that I've been describing. And just to mention very briefly some of these elements, what happening in many countries in our region, in Central America, probably this happening in other countries, is that many people working in the media, they are not media or communication or journalism trained. They come from different professions, or they are just, very handsome people, and so you can be a journalist, you can be just, be an anchor at the television. So this, to me, is very important element when you see many situations where they really don't know what they are doing because they haven't been in a communication or journalism school. On the other hand, of course, the people perceive and they said, yeah, they are journalists because they are in television, they are in the radio, they are working there. So they said, well, they are journalists and this is our perception of journalists. So of course, this is a problem when some people generalize and think that everybody is like these 2 or 3 people, somebody doing something that is not correct, that is not professional. On the other hand, I think, there has been a discussion in several forums about how the media can implement more self-regulations, But it seems to me that, especially in our countries, the media, more private media, we don't have public media, we have very little community media outlets. But the private media sector, I think they don't believe in this. When you talk with them about ethics, they say, yeah, but that's not something for us important. So, for example, we have a law, as we were saying before in El Salvador, that it's supposed that every media outlet has to have its own media code of ethics. But I always say, I don't know any media outlet in El Salvador that they said this is our code of ethics. But the law, it said they have to have their own media, their own code of ethics, and want to fulfill that code of ethics. And that can also be important for the work of journalists, or the work of media workers. And finally, I think, of course, the role of association of journalists, I think, is very important, but it's weak in many cases. People don't believe too much in this idea of being an association of journalists as a way also to improve the quality of journalism. And on the other hand, in other contexts, like in Honduras, that happened in several cases, journalists move very easily from politics to journalism. And so we have these cases in some of the killings that have happened in Honduras. It's very difficult to know what was the reason, because this person now is the director of one radio station, but 4 years ago was the mayor of one city, or was in the National Assembly. So, and it seems that in Honduras, is what I think, to be a good politician, probably you need to be a journalist first, because that's the way you get popularity, and you are very, like in El Salvador that happened too, just recently I was looking at one woman that she has a kind of talk show on television, and now she said, I'm going to run for politician because everybody knows me and I'm beautiful. So that happened, So this move between politicians and journalism, and this area is very not clear in several cases. And so I think we need, of course, to look at some cases, and we can document those cases where the very unprofessional practices later are related with some aggression or some attacks that are based specifically in practices that are very far from what we can consider ethical practice of journalism. So I don't know if that gives some elements.
Now, we are coming up towards the time of the end of the session, so I'm not sure we'll try 2 quick questions. We've got quite a few people who did want to ask questions. We've got one person looking very urgent here, and one over there. So perhaps if we get the questions together and try and address them reasonably quickly.
We actually have till 10:45, although we
We've got to
take.
oh, sorry, I forgot you.
Is that right? 10:45?
Oh, we've got lots of time, sorry. We'll
It
take
was,
those.
the program originally said 10:30, but now it's 10:45. I think they predicted that it would be an extra interesting session.
So 2 questions. One, actually taking on from just the experience of in El Salvador, but also raising the question to Masluki about the issue of threats to journalists, the fact that you said murders have gone down according to the statistics by AJI. But I think one of the issues or the challenges presented is also that it becomes a little bit sophisticated, the attacks. So it is couched in, say, previous political experiences, personal issues, sometimes accidents, staged in order to attack, so it's very difficult to verify. So maybe just to quickly ask, in your opinion, from RG's data and also from your own research, whether there is a way in which some of these contacts and nuances can come out, that the numbers may see a reduction, but is that the reality? That's one. Second question is, do you know exactly when the threats from the kind of the conservatism in Indonesia, for example, is there a period in which it had begun to show very evidently that the threats are coming from these groups, the non-state actors, in your research? Thank you.
We have to.
Should I ask the question or
Yes.
should we?
Because we've got a little bit more time, we might have just the question separate as well. That's this one.
okay.
Sorry, I've changed.
So this is a big question and very challenging question for me. The crime against journalists in Indonesia, in my opinion, is a complex situation. So in this opportunity today, I just trying to expose what have been done by AJI. So of course there are many limitations on this study. Because, what I know with AJI members, they only collect what public exposed in the what journalists exposed in the media houses, and also what they observed so far in their province. Of course, if we try to look at the wider context, there are many indicators, there are many aspects that drive the crime against journalists. Not only the political issues, but also economical issues, but also we now during the last 1 year talk more about the cyber crime against journalists. This is a matter of technological revolution. I try today to focus only on what AJI AJI done by its report. But I do agree with you. We need to look more than one side approach to understand this situation. Going to the second question from you, in my observation so far, the beginning of what you mentioned about non-state actors, crimes against journalists, for instance, maybe a radical group coming from, for instance, Islamic group association, is increasing again from the last five years after 2009, about after the election. And the most critical situation is in the last 1 year. I think you already aware on this situation also, where there is like a cyber war between the two supporters of gubernatorial Jakarta election, and there are many like a mass rally from the radical group during the last 4 months in Jakarta, center in Jakarta. In this series of events, there are many journalists being attacked by the group. But if you look at my last presentation today, I see that the situation is not simply like the radical group attack the journalists, but the situation is more complex because there is a tendency of politicization by the media owners. There is like a massive political intervention to the newsroom, for instance, to the Metro TV, and to TV1 we have here, owned by the political leaders. And in my opinion, in this case, there is a systematic crime against journalists done by the media owners, not only by the radical group. This, if I try to look at what AJI found on this issue. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bakash Chan. I work at Columbia University's Global Freedom of Expression Initiative. My question is that over the past couple of days, a lot of the kind of recommendations and whatnot came with the target of saying, well, academics should do something, civil society should do something, international organizations should do something. But I feel that what the digital revolution has done and what it's shown us over the past couple of years is that audiences have become so empowered and are so involved in, in the context of what journalists can produce, what they should produce, and even in as creating kind of some kind of statements or that could snowball into violence. And these are not, they don't necessarily come from politicians, but just random people online. So my question is then, should audiences, and could we even get involved? Could we involve them in these sort of conversations? Do we want to involve them in these conversations? Or should we just focus on trying to strengthen the existing normative frameworks, and hopefully that will be enough to get them on our side?
think that's a really important point. That one of the observations I made in this study in reference to sources is that sources can now go direct. I mean, they have curated their own audiences. They become whistleblowers in that effect, but with their anonymity. But they have been empowered, and we are in a situation where we are now, as media institutions, as journalists, as academics working in this space around freedom of expression and media freedom, needing to both educate and engage with those audiences. I mean, what the phenomenon that we're seeing, in the West currently, with the resurgence of populism, is being explained in part in reference to the sense of alienation that audiences have experienced as a result of media organisations and the academic elites not engaging with them. So what I'm impressed by in some contexts is seeing, the sorts of discussions that we're having here repurposed in a way that they become accessible for larger groups in society. I mean, audiences are interested in knowing when there is corruption, when there is abuse of power, that they want agency. So I think you make an excellent point, and I think we need to take ourselves outside of our institutions, media or academic or otherwise, and instead of meeting in isolation, which we need to continue to do, I have to say, because it's purposeful and meaningful, but we need to take this conversation to the public and empower citizens to have meaningful input, while recognising that in the process we have to deal with genuine destructive phenomena like online harassment and figure out ways to navigate that. I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question, but that's my thought on that. Do you have that?
Very briefly, I think, as you mentioned in your question, it depends on the perspective of the university. In Latin America, I'm coming from the Central American University, which is a Jesuit university, and we have a network of Jesuit universities in Latin America, from Mexico to Chile, Uruguay, and we are working on this issue of the right to communicate as an important element from the universities. What can we do in relation to this issue that you were mentioning? So it seems to me that in many cases in Latin America, there is a big separation or a distance between some organizations, civil society organizations or activists with the academia. So I think, and it's our perspective, that we need to work more, with other people, and the academia is not an elite. As you said, it shouldn't be an elite. It's an important actor. On the other hand, in Latin America, it's maybe in other countries happen too. Normally, media, the universities have their own media outlet. For example, in our university, we have our own radio station, we have a video center production, and we are planning to have online media for investigative journalism. The same is happening in other countries. So the media of the universities are also developing their own media outlets as a way to convey or to distribute a different perspective of what is coming from the private media sector, as I said. So I think, for example, in Latin America, we always discuss this idea of UNESCO, the importance of diversity and pluralism of media. Because if you have just private media, well, the perspective is very limited and is also with political intention. So I think the universities can also contribute to this broader perspective, a more complex perspective on some of the critical issues that we are dealing with. And finally, of course, I think that it's really important, the media literacy perspective, how we can do this. From the university perspective, I think it's a challenge, because as we know, the new digital generation, of course, they produce content. The thing is how we can also interact with them in terms of what we can do in media literacy, and to also to engage. I think this is a very important aspect, how to engage the people to become citizens, because this is a very important issue. Sometimes we assume that, everybody knows what it is to be a citizen and to have some political participation. So I think the universities should do something more about it.
Maybe part of the answer is in journalism programs, those of us who teach within journalism schools some people do this already, I know, but to make topics like the murder of journalists with impunity and journalism safety and broader human rights issues part of the agenda for their reporting assignments to ensure that they engage with their student colleagues on these issues. Can I just have 10 seconds to say one thing I forgot to say? That in the room, Julie Reid, Dr. Julie Reid, and Gayatri, whose last name I stumble over, so I'm going to let you say it yourself, formerly of CIAPA, sat on their review panel for this giant study, and at enormous speed, as we all worked, provided really thoughtful and rigorous feedback. So I just want to acknowledge that they're both here. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our four speakers. They've given excellent presentations. I do know there are a couple of people still wanting to ask questions, so I'd like to catch you over coffee. I actually suggest we all head out, actually get coffee, and the speakers would love to talk more about their topics.
So we're back at 11:15 for our next session.
Just to double check, the trauma session is in the afternoon, it's not the next one. Just here it's